One important part of the categorization and stereotyping process that I want to talk about really briefly, start this video, is something called the outgroup homogeneity bias. All this really means is that we have a tendency to see people in other groups, our outgroups, as all being the same as each other. So all people in X group are the same, whereas in our own groups, we tend to see everybody as like a unique kind of individual person, perhaps because we have more, association with those people directly. We know them more. We know their individual traits. We know the things that separate them from the other group members, and we might have less exposure and experience with people from groups to which we do not belong, and just perceive them as all being the same. So we believe there's greater similarity among members of groups we don't belong to than groups that we do belong to. And, this is commonly expressed colloquially in things like all people from X group are so whatever, that, they're all the same, they're all intelligent or criminals or violent or silly, or I don't know, whatever stereotype you apply to a particular group. But this goes along with the idea that if you learn something about somebody from a particular group, like you don't know very many people from some racial group or some particular religion, and you learn something about them, if that's your only frame of reference for this group, then unfortunately there's a tendency for you to apply that to other people in that group because you don't have other sources of information, so you just apply it widely to all those other people. Obviously, not everyone does this all the time, but it is a tendency that we have because of how we perceive these outgroups as being monolithic or singular, and not having very much differentiation within them. Two ideas that are really heavily related to this, that I'm not going to test you on because these ones are kind of philosophical and a little complicated, but I think they're worth mentioning because they're interesting, are the concepts of entativity and essentialism. Entativity has to do with perceiving different social categories as being coherent and discrete. And what I mean by this is, I talked about race and gender being socially constructed things already, but if you have an entative view of race or gender, for example, then you view the races as separate and discrete and coherent in some way. So there is a race of black people, and there is an Asian race, and let's say a white race and a South Asian race or something. And those things have no overlap, there's no gray area, people are in one group or they're in another, and those groups cohere in some way that is real and meaningful. That these groups have some sort of entitative properties. So that's kind of one idea that folds into this outgroup homogeneity bias. Another one is an idea called essentialism. Essentialism is that you need a certain set of traits to be a real member of a social category, and the more you violate those expectations about that group, the less that you or someone else is part of it. So there might be certain traits that make you a real Christian or a real black person or a real Tulane student or something like that. And that, people within these groups all have these types of traits in this view, so not having them means you're kind of violating the expectations of those groups. So you can see how these things fit into the outgroup homogeneity bias, that you might view other groups as some sort of coherent whole that have a bunch of necessary traits to be parts of them. So there's lots of really interesting work on these two ideas and how they fit into the development of different stereotypes and how they lead to prejudice and discrimination too. So just to kind of summarize some of the things I've talked about to this point about applying stereotypes, Just want to kind of, again, walk you through the sort of step-by-step process by which this happens. That we, are out in the social world, engaging with other people and perceiving different things about them. And in order to do that and simplify our world, we're automatically looking at things about them. We're seeing different defining features that in certain contexts might be useful to tell us things about the social world. So seeing people's skin color, or the clothes they're wearing, or how long their hair is, or how wealthy they look, or the type of place they're walking out of, or the sort of car that they drive, or the shape of their nose, or something like that that tells us something about that person. So this, we notice these different features, and those lead to us automatically categorizing people as members of social groups. Again, this is an automatic thing. We don't have to consciously think about it. We just kind of put people in those boxes mentally without trying to do it. It's an automatic process. And once we have people in those boxes, we bring to mind things that have to do with that box, so to speak. So if you've categorized somebody into the box of, being of a particular race, gender, ethnicity, age, whatever, you bring to mind the different culturally built up traits that are associated with that. Again, whether you believe them or not, when you activate the idea of a particular group, all the things that you have associated in your mind with that group come to mind to some degree. Once those things are brought to mind, then they are applied, frequently to that person or that situation, but sometimes even to other things in your environment or your perception. But this is, I think for a lot of people that have the experience of, not believing a lot of negative stereotypes about particular groups, it can explain that uncomfortable feeling that you might have when you see someone from a particular group and a negative thought comes to mind, and maybe a negative characterization of something that they're doing pops into your head, and you realize that it's wrong, and it is something that you should not think, and that person doesn't deserve to be thought of as, or the expectations you have are unfair about them or something. It's because of these types of processes that happen automatically. So none of us are immune from the way that this works. Even if you belong to a particular group that has some of these negative connotations about them, you still have this process going on, and it might affect the way that you perceive even your own group members to some degree. But we do know lots of things we talked about in prior lessons, that this process is another one of these sorts of dual process ideas, that if you have motivation and ability, then it might be more likely to be the case that you are able to subvert those stereotypical characterizations, or you're able to keep yourself from engaging in some sort of discriminatory behavior. If you're motivated, if you care, and if you're able, meaning if you're not stressed or distracted or tired or whatever, then you might be able to individuate rather than categorize, and think about people on their own rather than as part of some monolithic group idea that you're bringing to mind. So what does this all mean about stereotypes? Again, even if we really do not believe them, stereotypes are available to everybody. They come to mind automatically just from seeing somebody in a group, and they change how we think. They change how we view that person. They change how we view their circumstances. They change how we view other things in our environment. And sometimes this stuff is going on outside of our awareness. Particularly if we are not motivated and able, we're not going to be paying attention to these sorts of processes and how they are changing the way we think, feel, and act. And they can also influence, of course, the way that we behave. They change the way we behave towards the people that are targets of these stereotypes, and they can even change the way that people themselves behave. So, I mean, I think a lot of the ways that this might influence our behavior is self-evident, right? That if somebody is a member of a group that is stereotyped as being criminal, then maybe they're going to get pulled over more often, or somebody that works at a store is going to be more likely to watch them as they're in that store to make sure they're not stealing something, even though they're probably not likely to steal something anyway, of course. But that those stereotypes might guide people's perceptions and behavior, and then elicit confirmatory behaviors, as we've seen before. But I think we kind of understand all that stuff at this point, and I want to talk briefly about a different way that stereotypes might affect behavior and how they affect the behavior of the people being stereotyped. So a really important concept that I want to talk about for just a little bit is something called stereotype threat. And it's something that you may or may not be familiar with at this point from things outside of this class, but stereotype threat is the perceived danger of confirming a negative stereotype about one's in-group as a characteristic of oneself or one's group. So if I am a person in a group that everybody thinks is stupid, or that everybody thinks is slow physically, or that everybody thinks is mean, I am concerned about confirming the stereotype that I'm stupid or slow or mean. And I don't want to confirm that. So when someone finds himself in a situation in which they might confirm that expectation to somebody outside of their group, that's when stereotype threat happens. So if people think that your group is stupid and you're in a situation where your intelligence is being tested, that is a threatening situation. That stereotype, the negative stereotype, is threatening you, and you don't want to demonstrate stereotype congruent behaviors, basically. The original study that kind of coined the term stereotype threat and tested it was by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson. Joshua Aronson is not your textbook author. He is actually your textbook author's son. But Claude Steele is kind of the main person behind stereotype threat. And he was at Stanford at the time, actually still at Stanford, but he was studying why there's an achievement gap between black and white college students. These black students that are by all indicators that are fair, every bit as intelligent as their white counterparts, but they're not doing as well as their white counterparts in the classroom. So why is that happening? Well, this is why he developed this idea of stereotype threat, that there is a negative academic stereotype about black students, as there is for many different minority status groups. And being scared or nervous or anxious about kind of betraying your group and underperforming or doing poorly when people believe that your group is less intelligent than other groups can be a very threatening experience. So what Steele and Aronson did is they devised an experiment where they gave everyone the same types of tasks to do, but gave them different instructions. So a very common way of manipulating the situation that people are construing for themselves in social psychology. Excuse me. So they gave everybody these ACT questions, but they gave them one or the other set of instructions, that they were either diagnostic of their intellectual ability, so something like you might read when you're taking a standardized test, or that these are laboratory tools for studying problem solving, something a little lower stakes. It doesn't talk about your individual intellectual ability. It's more about the process of problem solving itself, rather than something about you in particular. So when they did this, they did it with white and black students, and you can see the chart I have here, the number of questions correct on the y-axis. Here we have the diagnostic condition and the non-diagnostic condition, with black subjects in the darker bars and white subjects in the crosshatched bars. And you see in the non-diagnostic condition, everybody does relatively well. There's no difference between the white and black students when there's no pressure that they're showing their intelligence. And the white students in the diagnostic condition, because they presumably don't have this negative stereotype, there's no negative expectations about the intelligence of whites in a college setting, they don't do any worse than they did in the non-diagnostic condition. The difference here is how black students performed in the diagnostic condition. When black students were told this is diagnostic of your intellectual ability, they did much more poorly than they did in the non-diagnostic condition, and more poorly than the white students did in the diagnostic condition. So, I mean, this on the left is basically your standard classroom experience where you know you're in a class and taking tests to show how smart you are and to achieve. So there's that pressure, and white students don't feel it because there's no negative expectation for them. For black students, they're constantly having to prove themselves and disprove negative stereotypes, and that is an anxiety-producing sort of situation to be in. It is distracting, it is physiologically arousing, it is lots of different things that are going to lead to worse performance. So a really pernicious thing about stereotype threat is that kind of in the same way, we activate these stereotypes and they might guide our perceptions even if we don't endorse them. That's true even for your own group. So if you have this negative stereotype that is activated about your group, you probably know that it's not true. Like black students know that they're not stupid. Students in other minority groups know that they're not, dumb or lazy or bad at a particular subject necessarily. But the fact that other people think that about you and you have to disprove it is enough. That activation of that negative stereotype is distracting enough, even if you know it isn't true. Maybe even because you know it isn't true, that you find this extra distracting thing taking away from your performance. And it's really important to know that this doesn't only happen with respect to African American students, and it's not only about testing domains. So there's evidence that this same sort of stereotype, like I said, happens for other groups that have negative stereotypes about their intelligence, other minority students, people in the southern United States, and people of lower socioeconomic status. It happens in particular domains too, so there are not negative stereotypes across the board for all groups in intelligence, but there are negative stereotypes with respect to women about their math ability and how they are with money. So if you subject women to different tasks that have to do with this, they will tend to show decrements in those stereotype threat type conditions when they wouldn't show them with respect to other subjects that don't have a negative stereotype for women associated with them. One very interesting study that I always remember has to do with how these things can really generalize to contexts that you might not expect. So this point that I have here has to do with the negative stereotype. There's nothing to do with like performance necessarily, but there's a negative stereotype with homosexuals and homosexual men that they are sexually deviant in some way, and that this sexual deviancy idea gets caught up in other types of gets caught up with other practices that people that are deviant, basically. What I'm trying to say is that particularly, 15 or 20 years ago, but still today, people conflate homosexuality with other, I keep saying this in an indelicate way that I don't mean. People conflate homosexuality with things like pedophilia sometimes, with being attracted to children or being a deviant sexually in some way. And this study had to do with bringing straight and gay men to a daycare to play with children. So they assume that people were aware of this kind of connection that people have with homosexuality and being in some way unsavory. Um, and they randomly assigned gay and straight men to either have a question on like a form they had to fill out to uh, play with children on the playground, um, that asked them about their sexual orientation or not. So in the not condition, where they don't have to answer any questions, there's no threat there, right? But for homosexual men that had to or were asked to answer a question about their sexual orientation, to say to people that are, presumably seeing something about how they're interacting with children that they are gay, there's some threatening thing that they have to show that they're like a responsible, normal, not deviant person, basically. So when these men had to or got to play with kids, um, it was kind of the same pattern that you saw with black and white students in the classroom. When no one had to disclose their sexuality, everybody was, having a good time with the kids. The kids were having fun. Nobody was anxious. And when straight men disclose their sexuality, then, there's no difference for them either. But gay men, by virtue of being aware that people who know that they are gay are watching their performance, then watching them interact with children, were more reserved. They were anxious. The kids had less fun. So this isn't just about like domains where there's a test going on or a race being run or something. It can extend to other very different sorts of domains that might be sort of unexpected. Okay. This also can extend to groups that generally don't have negative stereotypes associated with them in these domains. So for white men, there's not generally negative stereotypes about performance in academic domains for white men necessarily, but when compared to other groups, like compared to Asian men, there's a stereotype that Asian men are really good at math compared to white men, and a stereotype that black men are really athletic compared to white men. So for white men, when they are being compared to a group that is stereotypically better than them at something, then they tend to show stereotype threats. So white men being worse at math when compared to Asian men, and white men literally running slower because they're being compared to black men. So this translates not just to mental things, but to physical things as well. One other one that I'll mention that I don't have a bullet point up here for is that this is really flexible based on people's identities too. So a really interesting study had to do with a sample of all Asian American women, and it changed the test in order to see if there were different sorts of effects based on the identity that was salient for them in the moment. So they had everybody do an English test and a math test. And, women in this study, they talked about women being stereotypically good at English and poor at math, and about Asian people being stereotypically poor at English and good at math. And they were able to, manipulate the identity that people had salient, making it salient for some women that they were Asian, and for some women that they were women. And they saw differences in people's performance based on the identity that was salient. That if it was salient that they were Asian, they did better at math and less well at English. And if salient they were women, they did better at English and did less well at math. So these things are really flexible based on the types of stereotypes that are activated in a particular moment. One thing I'll leave you with for this video, before we move on to talk about the stereotype content model and the next one, is just a quick thing that I think also demonstrates how pervasive and pernicious stereotypes can be, excuse me, in ways that we might not always expect. That the way that we talk about, kind of quote unquote normal things in our everyday lives are kind of infused with these stereotypical ideas. So when you're talking about a job, for example, you might describe it in a particular way, or describe a person that holds a job in a particular way. And these phrases, white rapper, male nurse, black president, female CEO, they probably all sound relatively normal, and maybe you've said them or you've heard people say them, and it didn't really seem odd to you at all, even though having these qualifiers is kind of odd, right? In a sense. Um, Other ones probably would sound weird to you if people said them in a particular context, like a black rapper, a female nurse, a white president, a male CEO. Those things, they sound maybe unnecessary because our stereotypes about rappers, nurses, presidents, and CEOs are that they are black, they're women, they're white, and they're male in that order. Um, so when you have things that fit your stereotype, you tend not to make those sorts of uh, distinctions or clarifications. But when somebody bucks the stereotype or goes against it, you might find yourself clarifying without being asked to, right? I mean, frequently people you might be saying something like male nurse when nobody asks you about the gender of that person, or you might clarify that somebody has a position that maybe violates some stereotype about their identity. So just another way that these things are coming up in our everyday lives that in some level can seem sort of innocuous, but they really do have impacts on the way we perceive people, because the way we perceive them influences the way that we treat them. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and I'll resume with stereotype content.